Okay, so here we are at chapter 11, and I'm going to do a lot of lecturing in this chapter because I really want you to understand these theories, and I'm going to do an additional one on basic Freudian theories. So that will be, I think I might make that like an actual video because I don't really have PowerPoints for it. Maybe I'll make some PowerPoints. And I'm going to add those, I'm going to add that lecture in because you need to understand it from an emotional perspective. So we're going to start with Erikson. It feels like we're going backwards because the psychodynamics that I want you to understand from a Freudian perspective are the underlying theoretical foundations of this theory, okay? So Erikson studied in the Freudian school and felt like there was pieces missing. So whereas Freud's stages are called the psychosexual stages, Erikson's are adding in the social aspect of it. And there's a really good reason for that. Erikson, as a person, struggled with his own identity, right? So it's when you get into personality theory and any kind of real theory of learning or whatever, you will find that the theorist's personal life really has a huge impact on how they come to understand the world around them as it reflects their own conflicts. And Erikson's biggest conflict was around the sense of identity. So he was born into a couple, they were entertainers, they were like actors and entertainers, and they separated. So he was alone with his mother. And then his mother, when he was very young, married a man who was of Jewish faith, and Erik and his mother were not. And so Erik was like this Germanic, or I don't know if he was blonde or redhead or something, but he did not look like the rest of his Jewish community that was much more darker skin, darker hair. And he got teased a lot. And so when he left home, he went in search of his identity. So his identity and where he belonged and group belongingness was so important to him in his own life that when he started studying, he became kind of a rebel. He did things he wasn't expected to do. He ran off to find himself. He didn't want to be defined by anybody. And so he actually legally changed his name to Erikson. So the reason, it's not like he had terrible parents who named him Erikson. He became Erikson because he was the son of himself, right? So the son of Erikson. So he became Erikson. And so, of course, he developed a theory that really put this idea of social development at the forefront of what children go through. So he broke it down into 8 stages. And the ones that we want to focus on the most are obviously the ones for early childhood, right? So let's talk about the very beginning. Trust versus mistrust. This is in infancy. So if you can, let's picture an infant. We've done a ton of observation. With little kids. Let's think about infancy. I don't know if we've done enough observation about infancy. Maybe I'll have you focus there. It's very hard because, again, remember, it's nonverbal. So what a child in their infancy needs is consistency. Okay, so this will correspond to Freud's oral phase, and I'll get into that later. Because for Freud, everything had to do with the neurobiological underpinning because he was a neurologist, so his theory reflected his experiences. And so you have this sort of biological piece to what's going on in infancy, like we talked about back in our studies of biology. And then you have laid on top of that the beginnings of what Freud was thinking about with regard to relationships with objects, people, objects in the world, and the inner world and the outer world. And Erikson really looked at that as what part of our identity and relationships are we forming? What social aspect is there to that? And for infants, it is this idea of trust, this idea of consistency, that tomorrow will be the same as today. So when I cry, I get picked up. When I'm hungry, I get fed. When I'm cold, I get warm. And that those experiences that occur on a consistent basis, day in, day out, with the same caregivers, allows a child to have trust in the world. That tomorrow will be the same as today, and that good things happen, and it kind of gives you a sense of hope, right? Without the idea of trust, there is not a lot of hope. And so if you have trust issues What you lacked in your life was the consistency of your social relationships, your social others, potentially at a very early time in your life. I mean, it's hard to say, it depends. If you have conflicts that come up from this early trust versus mistrust stage or oral phase, which Freud would relate to dependency issues in later adulthood, your pathology gets pretty severe. This is not sort of a place where things go wrong and you just become sort of neurotic. When you see people that have been abused in infancy or have been neglected in infancy or have been left hungry in infancy, you really get a huge breakdown of the self. We call it severe and early disturbance. And it makes for a very, very difficult childhood and a really, really even more difficult adulthood. So then we make it to toddler years, and this is where Freud would focus on things like toilet mastery, body mastery, the anal phase, and Erikson called this autonomy versus shame and doubt. So for Erikson, this is the I do it phase, right? This is the I do it for myself phase. This idea that I can dress myself even if I do it wrong. I can be the boss of my body. I can tell my body when to stop because I have to go to the potty. I can learn to walk. I can learn, not only do you get to learn to walk, but you also get to run away for the first time, right? And so you get this less passive, much more active. So what are usually some of the first words? Some of the first words that go along with this are no. And so Freud saw this as a separation phase. Erikson sees this as an autonomy phase. And this idea that if you are, told or in any way shown that you are not a child who can be independent, who can be autonomous, if somebody takes over those functions for you, the negative result of that conflict is shame and doubt. Right? And this sense of an I can do it attitude comes out of it if you can work through this in a very healthy way. So if you have parents who are having a hard time letting their toddler be a toddler, or they personally struggle with their feelings of loss as a toddler pushes away and tries to separate and tries to become their own person, and you're going to get this sense of dependency that develops, but it really develops into this idea of self-doubt, like the self is not good, the self is not worthy, it is not an independent, autonomous self. And you can end up with like a false self and all that kind of stuff. Now you have the preschool years and you go much more into independence and taking initiative. So now imagine, so this is preschool. So you're talking about you're talking about a verbal kid. This is a kid for Freud. The overlay here is movement into the phallic phase, the phallic narcissistic phase, the look at me phase, the phase where you're starting to figure out that you are a boy, that you are a girl, that you belong to certain groups. And this idea of taking initiative, versus these feelings of guilt, and being able to increase that level of independence as you move through these stages, right? So for Erikson, it was finding yourself in this taking initiative versus feeling guilty. Then as we move into elementary school, so now we're really going into what Freud would have called latency, which is when the biological psychosexual stuff starts to die down. And interestingly enough, it happens at a time, not interestingly, by the way, folks, it happens at a time when neurologically and biologically there's this cognitive explosion of capacity to learn, right? Language is mastered. You start going off to school, and there's this idea of performance. And this is where a lot of you guys are going to be focused as elementary school teachers, starting in that first grade. So this is where you start to deal with really feelings of inferiority if you cannot keep up, if you have a hard time learning a particular subject, if you feel like everything is a mistake and you crumple up your paper and you don't know the difference between little, medium, and big mistakes, you begin to feel not good about yourself. And this is why we really focus in preschool and kindergarten and first grade, getting a child to a place where they feel good about learning. They feel good about their sense of autonomy, about taking an initiative, about their ability to produce. good work and feel proud of good work, that they've internalized the external feelings, right? So when you're taking initiative and you say, autonomy and initiative in those first two phases, and you say, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it. And the person, the grown up, the important grown up around you says, good job, great work, you should be so proud of yourself. These are the kinds of things as a teacher you want to say. You want to transition from, I am proud of you, to you must feel so proud of yourself. Because when you do that, the child internalizes a sense of goodness, a sense of strength in their initiative, and a sense of their ability to produce good work and to be smart and to be effective. And that is what elementary school is all about, really, is this feeling of I can be good on my own in the world, and I can produce things of value in the world. And it sets up the tone. It makes so much more sense to me when you overlay it over an understanding of Freudian theory. So that's why I'm going to give that to you, because I think it brings a depth to it, a sense of the good self, a sense of being able to separate from your parents and survive it and become your own person and develop friendships and of being able to take all of those good feelings about yourself out into the world without having the constant need to depend on and rely on the emotional holding up of your parents. And so the teacher really takes over. And if we're talking about kind of what's happening now, the challenge of educating these elementary school kids from home is just this, that they are really trying, they're really just trying to do this thing where they separate from their parents and have their work be separate from mom and dad and be about teachers. And now they're all back at home. Their parents are having to monitor their work, and there's a lot of conflict around it. And so kids aren't getting as much done. They're having a hard time focusing. We've just taken them out of the context that is such a scaffolding to their ability to be independent learners, that a lot of kids are falling apart and their parents are falling apart and the teachers are kind of struggling. I mean, I don't know. Lots of research is going to have to be done on the impact of this sort of second half of the school year being done at home. Whether you guys, whether people are doing Zoom conferences or just sending packets home depends on, quite frankly, the financial resources of the community that these kids are living in. But it's really hard for kids to make that kind of shift, because part of their separation from their parents, their primary role, was we spent years in preschool and kindergarten teaching them how to separate from their parents and to treat a teacher different from their parent. And now we've just flipped the switch and gone backwards. And that makes it an even bigger challenge than I think people are giving it credit for. And so we have to make sure we are protecting the sense of identity and independence, and feel goodness, if you will, of schoolwork. And I think we're struggling with that right now. We'll have to see how that plays out when school gets back in the fall. It's going to be hard. And so then somewhere around fifth grade, if you're going to teach fifth grade at the sort of tail end of this early childhood certification, then you're really seeing a transition from latency into the beginnings of early adolescence. And with early adolescence, the whole role of adolescence, and by the way, that continues as far as I'm concerned into your 20s at this point, because you're not fully identified as the person you're going to be, right? There's a lot of role confusion that you have to go through where you try on different things. And so, you start to hit that puberty mark, and that's the mark for Freud, was entering into puberty and the changes in hormones and the development of secondary sex characteristics and moving into this genital phase. And, interest in boys, interest in girls, interested in sexuality starts to come to the forefront, and social dynamics change. And then you sort of figure out what kind of person are you going to be. And so maybe you try being a vegan, or you try, you decide what's important to you. You develop a clique socially, and you all want to dress the same way, and you start to do your final separation emotionally from your parents, which may start in fifth grade, which is why middle schoolers have such terrible relationships often with their parents, because they're still so very, very young to be separating. but there is a biological sort of drive and a psychological drive to do that for object removal. So you guys will see in fifth grade, not all kids, some kids will be still very much in latency in fifth grade and very much in industry versus inferiority. And other kids will start making head like, what's the word I'm looking for? Strivings, I guess would be the way to say it, would be making these sort of initial strivings into adolescence. So fifth grade, if you're going to choose to teach fifth grade, you're going to get a very mixed bag in terms of the emotional development of the kids in your classroom. There's really kids who enter adolescence early are very different than kids who are staying, in latency, in industry versus inferiority. And they can have a hard time socializing with each other because there seems to be such this huge disparity from one kid to the next in terms of what they're interested in, what they've outgrown, what they haven't outgrown, how far they are into puberty, if they've started puberty at all. It can be, fifth grade can be hard. It can be a very confusing time. And then he has his adulthood ones, which you can read about in your book. I'm not going to go over them. I'm going to save us some time in these lectures. You guys are in intimacy versus isolation, but you're also still a little bit in adolescence because you're just sort of figuring yourselves out. And you have to be, this is why teenage pregnancy is a bad plan. Because if you haven't finished identity versus role confusion before you have a child and have to become a parent, it's very hard to go into the phase of parenthood if you don't know who you are as an individual. And this intimacy versus isolation phase is all about how you relate to the outside world. So it's about developing intimate relationships, being in a partnership, being able to compromise in relationships and not be selfish and all those sorts of things. And as you can see, it's better to finish that and move into generativity. Generativity is really about giving back, right? And so when you're in a stage of generativity, you're much better at being a parent because you're able to put yourself aside. You've done enough work on yourself and your own identity development, according to Erikson, to really then put yourself aside and give back. And so you have this early generativity, which I wouldn't even say is middle age, quite frankly. But at the end of young adulthood, then you go into sort of this desire to be a parent and a desire to give back. And that's sort of the natural course of human development. So when you truncate that and you go into parenthood in the middle of your identity versus role confusion time, you end up with a lot of conflicts. And you'll talk to successful teenage parents who say that they really grew up with their child. And it can be really hard for them because they're very young when their child kind of ages out and does this separation, and they have no clue who they are when they're not being a parent, and they have to rediscover themselves. And so they circle back and finish their adolescent conflict once their child is older. They kind of have to figure all of that out all over again. Okay, so that's sort of Erikson in a nutshell. The strengths of his theory: the importance of social emotional changes that occur throughout life, yes. The synthesis of all of these different ideas, and they, early theories like Freud and like Erikson, a lot of this was done based on working with patients and observational data. We didn't have the same testing and things, and so everybody's going to have a critique about the observations. But more recent research over the years has really supported this theory in its basic foundations. And I don't know if he underestimated the effects of culture. He just didn't take it into account, the impact of culture. And some of the things around identity that we'll talk about are impacted a great deal by culture. It's not necessarily in this chapter, but it's coming up when we talk about the impact of culture, is that sometimes one does not struggle with identity as much as one forecloses into an identity based on the expectations of their culture, and how much of an impact that has on identity, I think, is what he just didn't cover in his theory. But as the bare bones of it, I think he was pretty right on. When you work with kids, you can see them going through these phases, and you can see them really struggling with these concepts and these ideas. All right, so let's talk about attachment theory. This started with people like Bowlby. And what they were saying also was in a reaction to Freud, which is, Freud really talked about adults as objects. I mean, in some ways in the translation, it translated into the word object, so that the mother in the beginning, before there is language, before there is the word mother, there is this idea of an external object in the world who takes care of you. And he really focused on things like the sex as sort of the drive to procreate. He was very much into Darwin, and aggression, the competitive part of us, the thing that separates us from other people, the survival instinct. And what the attachment theorists came along and said is that there really is a third drive. It's not just, the striving toward a connection and a pushing away from that, but that there is this separate drive in human development, which is this need for relationship. If any of you have studied this, if you haven't taken intro psych yet, when you do, you'll hear about the rhesus monkey studies, where these poor little monkeys were taken from their mother, and they had a choice of mother. They had a wire mother that was uncomfortable to sit on, but offered food through a bottle. And then they had a cloth mother, which was a piece of wood wrapped in like cloth or carpet or something, and had like a little monkey face, but offered no sustenance. And the monkeys preferred the soft mother to the mother who gave them food. And the ones who didn't have the soft mother became kind of psychotic as monkeys. And so that was really sort of the beginning of research into what happens to people when they don't have an attachment consistent object in their life. And so we think about this when we think about daycare, when we think about parents having to go back to work when kids are 6 weeks old. And we think about this in orphanages and in international adoptions, this need, and we can go back to Erikson, because Erikson really talked about this with regard to trust versus mistrust and the need for consistency. And Freud talked about it in terms of this dependency piece and this oral phase and the need for consistency. I think the one thing everybody agrees on, you can call it all kinds of things, and you can move attachment to the front or to the back or whatever in terms of your importance. But what we know, the important take-home piece to know, is that in infancy, developing these enduring emotional ties are vital. They are vital. Anna Freud talked about the annihilation anxiety, that a child without a parent dies, right? They can do nothing for themselves. The human infant is very dependent in the early years. They need that parent to survive in all ways. They can't get their own food. They can't keep themselves warm. They're not mobile. And so there's this enduring emotional tie. Now, the attachment theorists would say that the emotional attachment in and of itself is important, whereas Freud would really argue that the attachment develops secondary to the need for these outside objects to fulfill your personal needs. See, one is more transactional, and attachment theory, though, is more instinctual, that the attachment itself, and that's where the monkey thing comes in, right? Because Freud would have said that the monkeys would attach to the wire mother, sort of, because of the need for the food, and the attachment theorists are like, no, monkeys will give up the food in order for the attachment, so the attachment is not necessarily tied to getting their biological needs met. So that's kind of the argument there. So the human capacity for close relationships evolved over millions of years, and there's separation anxiety is a thing, right? So separation anxiety, and you're going to find this in the kids that you work with, more separation anxiety the younger the kid is. They are attached to their parents and they feel safe and secure with their parents. And if their attachment is a secure attachment, the parent becomes sort of a safe base of operation. But if there's been a separation, let's say you've got a parent who travels a lot, or you've got a depressed mother, or you have an absent father, or you have a parent who gets sick and is gone from you, there is this sort of grief and mourning that happens, and this sense that it's not safe to leave home, because you don't necessarily trust, again, we're with trust, that the grown-ups will be there when you get back. And so you need this sort of safe haven. One of the things Anna Freud said is that a parent is there to be left, which means that the parent has to be the one who can tolerate being left. And oftentimes parents struggle with this. And so you can have sort of these wonky attachments where the parent feels too much grief and they try to hold the child back from separation. And so then the child develops this idea that separation injures the parent and destroys the parent, and then the child feels guilty about that. And so you get this sort of failure to separate, and the attachment piece of it gets weird, or parents who disappear emotionally every once in a while. The child can't separate well because they don't know what they're going home to. So when you have a child who's having separation anxiety, you need to really understand that need for the parent. So in our classrooms, when we have kids, many kids who come into preschool who are having separation issues, we slowly and gradually separate them. The parent starts out in the classroom with them, and then they go to the waiting room, and then they take a half an hour walk. And the child is able to come and go from the classroom to check in, to touch base. It's like we create that secure base for the kids to move in and out of and back and forth. And so there are things you can do in the classroom. Even in, kindergarten or whatever, or first grade, if a child needs to call their parents on their lunch break, or carry a picture around of their parents with them to keep them in mind, if they haven't had a good attachment, or maybe they were adopted later in life and they have attachment disorders, where they don't feel like they trust, like they missed out on those early phases of developing trust and intimacy and working through their dependency, so they don't feel like they have a secure base to explore the world from. And it gets in the way of their learning, it gets in the way of developing social relationships, and it really has to be addressed. It has to be addressed head on. And sometimes the attachment pieces have to be worked through, and with a therapist. Sometimes it gets that bad. All right, so pre-attachment, using social signals to elicit care. So social smiling works. There's a lot of videos all over the internet that will show you what it looks like when a parent smiles and then the child smiles, and then the child learns to smile and get the parent to smile. And so, and then crying also is a way to elicit care, right? And then attachment in the making is really about... the way the attachment people talk about it, it's not that much different than the way Freud talked about it, quite frankly. It's that attachment to the consistent caregiver. So the consistent caregiver becomes the special person, right? So the people who regularly provide you with care become your attachment figures. They become the objects who meet your need. They become singularly important to you, and you prefer them over all other people, because people who don't look like them, smell like them, sound like them, talk like them may or may not offer you what you need. And so those attachment figures become singularly important to you. We know that there's obviously a clear-cut attachment when a child protests at separation and seeks out a particular person for comfort, okay? So when a child is dropped off, if you've ever worked at a daycare, when they get dropped off at daycare, they protest when the parent leaves. They don't want the parent to leave. That is perfectly normal and natural. We don't want that to necessarily go away. The way that we can talk to kids about that is that when they get dropped off and they're crying or whatever that might be happening, is you just need to repeat to them, whether it's a mom or a dad, like, moms always come back. Moms always come back. They will be back at the end of the day. And the reason why you can then slowly separate is because every day that child gets picked up from school, they learn that there is a consistency and a trust, that every day moms come back. They leave and they come back. They leave and they come back. They leave and they come back. And then that becomes a repetitive pattern that they could trust. And so it makes sense. And then when they're unhappy or they're scared, they might be out running around in the world, but when you fall down, you go home, right? So maybe many of you got nervous or anxious even at your age, and were so relieved to just be at home. I don't know if you guys are being driven crazy by your families now because you're in an adolescent separation phase, and so there's a dependency part of you when the world gets scary that wants to be at home and feel safe, but there's the independent separating part of you that's probably going a little bit crazy because now you're back in your parents' house and you don't have the same kind of freedom and you can't go out, and then it's like, oh my God, get me away. And yet at the same time, you can have that ambivalent feeling. And little kids have that too. They have that ambivalent feeling of wanting to explore the world, but needing to be able to turn around and see their parent is there waiting for them to catch them if they fall. Emotionally or physically, by the way, falling. And then stranger anxiety. So stranger anxiety is not a bad thing. because you have to learn who to trust, right? Beyond your primary caregivers. Okay, going to school, early childhood. Children learn that other caregivers can be dependable and trustworthy. This is where kids, for you guys, learn the concept of what a teacher is, or maybe a babysitter as well, a daycare provider, a nanny, an au pair, another special someone who they can, feel safe with. And one of the things that parents have to do when kids are experiencing separation anxiety is come into the classroom with the child, because what they're communicating when they do this with the child is that I, as your primary caregiver, trust this person, and I am putting them in charge of your care because I trust them. And I expect you to learn from them, and I expect you to respect them, and I expect you to like them, and I'm not going to get jealous, and it's okay, and all of those other things to give the child permission so they can transfer the trust they have in their parent over to the person that the parent trusts, right? So they borrow that from the parent. And then, of course, they become attached to their peers. You start to see that develop. That also has to do with a security thing, being away from their parents. They can be very lonely, but what they will do is they will find, by experience of being out there, that the company of their friends can also create a sense of safety and connectedness and attachment. And so then they start to have friends. And, we'll talk about play, I think, in a later chapter with regard to like parallel play and how play develops over time. Okay, so middle childhood and adolescence is when you venture further outside your nuclear family and you seek different forms of affection from family. So subtler forms of affection. You're not going to sit on the couch and cuddle with your family as you get older. It's more just you can be up in your room and know that they're in the house, and you feel safer knowing that they're in the house, but you don't necessarily need to be with them all the time. So Ainsworth did this stranger situation, and it's sort of an iconic study. This is exactly what happens. The infant plays in a lab with the mother present, and then a stranger enters, and then the mother leaves. And then the mother returns, and the stranger leaves. The mother leaves, leaving the child alone. Stranger returns without the mother, and then the mother returns and the stranger leaves. And they look at how the child handles this kind of scenario. And what they came up with were these identifiable patterns. So a secure attachment shows distress at departure and joy at reunion. So when we see kids, that's what we're looking for, okay? We're looking for the best relationships is when a child shows distress at departure and joy at reunion. So just because a kid comes in and doesn't seem to care if their parents leave does not necessarily mean that they love separating from their parent. It can actually be an insecure avoidant, right? Oblivious, may not notice the departure or may not even respond to the reunion. That is not a fantastic relationship, okay? Insecure resistance, there is distress at departure, and they may show anger at reunion. We see this kind of insecure resistance stuff a lot in kids whose parents have been divorced and they've been forced at a very young age to have a crazy parenting schedule. And so you'll see kids get real pissed off at their parents. And it usually shows up in the reunion is where you notice it the most. They'll be distressed like an attached kid would be at departure, but it's when they come back. The reunion is an aggressive one. And then disorganized are kids who have attachment issues, and they're inconsistent. There's no specific pattern or predictable way of responding. All right, so what are some of the factors that are affecting attachment? Quality of the caregiver-child relationship, obviously. The consistency, responsiveness, the sense of control over the relationship, the affection that's shown. That's sort of the quality of the caregiver, like a responsiveness, the feeling of safety. I always tell parents, my thing right now is a healthy household starts with a healthy adult. And if the adult is anxious, then the child is anxious. And if the caregiver is not consistent and develop a sense of trust, then they're going to have a huge impact, obviously, on the attachment, right? So they need to be responsive. They need to be able to show affection. And then the children's characteristics, their moods, their behaviors, abilities, and disabilities. One of the difficulties for parents with children with autism is that oftentimes they have a hard time emotionally attaching. And it's hard because it can feel like a one-way relationship without getting much in return. And then the cultural setting, likelihood of physical contact and separation, societal expectations for responding to distress, whether or not they go to their parents for comfort. And you have to take a look at the culture that they come from and what the norms are with regard to parent-child relationships. Some are much more formal, right? Some are much more relaxed. All right. Multiple attachments. We are capable of multiple attachments, but in early infancy, it is preferential to have one. And quite frankly, it's usually the mother because she's usually the one doing the feeding. In same-sex relationship, it's whichever parent does the most feeding, right? So it's the person who does the most intimate care on a more consistent basis. But soon, attachments with other caregivers can occur. So once that basic trust is set up, then the other parent comes into play, and then there's different types of attachments to each caregiver, and then teachers, and we kind of already talked about that, right? And having a network, this is the sort of it takes a village, right? The more strong attachment figures you have, the more benefit to a child. So children usually get really attached to their first grade teachers. So be aware of that and don't become a substitute parent. Make sure in first grade you are a teacher, not a parent. And the way you can do that is when certain feelings come up, like I don't recommend kids sitting in your lap. I don't recommend hugs. I think the teachers who do like these funky handshakes and stuff, those are cute. They're not absolutely necessary, but it's sort of a different way to interact in a teacher sort of way that's unique and specific to the teacher attachment, the teacher relationship. And so you kind of have to find your way through all of that. But they need to learn what is a teacher, and a teacher is an attachment figure, but they lose you at the end of the year. So you can't be a substitute parent. That does not help with separation anxiety at all. All right, so what do we know? Secure attachment predicts independence, empathy, and social competence in later life. Okay, so when we see a kid who is showing good attachment in preschool, that's what it is predicting later in life. And you see kids being more self-confident, better school adjustment, better relationship with teachers and peers. They're more successful because they don't have all kinds of emotional stuff following them into the classroom, so they can focus more, and they're more likely to graduate high school. I mean, there's just so many positive things that come out of having a strong attachment to your primary caregivers. Okay, so implications of research on attachment. Caring for children with warmth and sensitivity, giving children time to adjust to new settings and separations, promoting emotional bonds through being affectionate, encouraging parents to watch children's self-initiated actions, encouraging parents to think about how infants and children understand different events. So from their perspective, I spend 90% of my career doing this, helping other adults see the world through the eyes of the children that they are with. What I am teaching you now is exactly that. It is how to understand and think about how children understand the world so that you can help them to learn, that you can help them to be emotionally adjusted, you can help them to develop friendships. It is about seeing the world through their eyes and understanding developmentally what they're going through. That is 90% of my job, is to get that across to either the parents of the kids I have in therapy or the parents that I'm teaching or the teachers that I'm teaching to work with those children. If you can really, really get these developmental concepts, where are they biologically? Where are they psychologically? Where are they emotionally? Where are they socially? And you really get it and understand your elementary school kids, you will be 600 times the teacher that someone who doesn't really see the world through the children's eyes will be down the road. And understand, we'll talk about this, the whole idea of parents with special needs. You'll get that more in your special ed class. But think about the level of attachment here, the narcissistic attachment. This is my child. If there is a disability or something wrong, the parents take it very, very personally. And you just want to be really gentle when you're talking to someone about the special needs of their children. Okay, help children maintain attachment to both parents if separation occurs. That's not your job. Your job is to be Switzerland with regard to a divorce, and and allow the child to love both parents. Advocate for stability in employed caregivers, encourage multiple attachments, offer services when children are placed with new families. These are not your jobs, by the way. These are things that we can do in the community, but as a teacher, these are not your jobs. You can encourage sympathetic dispositions, which means developing empathy in children. Be sensitive, consistent with children who show attachment problems. So important. If you have a kid who has an attachment issue, I am not kidding. If you are a teacher and you are going to cut your hair, get glasses, get new glasses, make your hair a different color, you tell your children ahead of time. It's going to sound ridiculous and like you're asking for permission, but if you want to save yourself a lot of hassle, tell your children ahead of time if you're going to be cutting your hair or changing your hair or changing your appearance or growing a beard or shaving off a beard, any of those massive changes that you might be making, that will just tell them ahead of time. Warning and preparation are so much better than surprise when it comes to being consistent with kids who have attachment issues. And it's easier if you just do it with all kids, and then you don't have to worry about which ones are going to freak out and which ones aren't. Addressing the needs of everyone in the family, again, not your job. And seek professional guidance when attachment problems are serious. That just means when you have a kid who clearly has some attachment issues. You know, this story of somebody that I worked with once who I found out later. I mean, I was dealing with this person when they were in middle school and they had a school phobia. They really could not go to school. We had to homeschool for a while we worked through it. This child had such severe separation anxiety in preschool and kindergarten, and nobody did anything about it. The mother didn't know, and the child would have memories of sitting in the classroom and just quietly crying at her desk all day long. Be aware of the quiet ones. Be aware, because nobody helped that kid, and she developed such a school phobia by the end of elementary school that it was like barely possible for her to go to middle school. It was so bad. Her separation was so bad. Okay, so emotions. Affective states are emotions, right? Affect and emotions, we use those interchangeably in the world. So all children experience emotions, happiness and fear. You know, emotions, we are born with the capacity to experience emotions. We are tired, we are angry, we are cranky. They can identify happiness and fear. Equilibrium versus disequilibrium. Comfort versus discomfort turns into an expansive vocabulary of different emotions, right? Happy, sad, fearful. Learning to regulate their emotional displays and feelings. I mean, I could do an entire semester on children learning to regulate an emotional displays and feelings. This is my job. When a child comes in and they have an anxiety disorder, or if you are struggling with an anxiety issue, even right now, you know, what people are struggling with is this ability to modulate an emotion that ends up feeling bigger than they are. And little kids, when they first start to feel super angry in toddlerhood, we call it the terrible twos for a reason. They do not have the cognitive capacity, or what Jack and Carrie Kelly Novick would call emotional muscle, to modulate and quiet that emotion, right? So again, a lot of the work that I do as a therapist is to help kids find ways to manage their feelings, right? Aren't those the words we use when we have a classroom full of kids and they're having a conflict? We want them to manage their anger. How do we help them to talk through their disagreements with each other, to negotiate peace between warring factions, right? Is all about, we don't hit, we don't bite. We use our words, we use our calm words. We have an entire program at Hannah Perkins called My Mad Feelings that does this very thing. And so a lot of what's happening in early childhood is helping kids to manage their big emotions. And then you end up having to do it all over again in middle school when the hormones come into effect, and then the feelings again get kind of super huge and hard to manage and overwhelming, and we have to find new ways to self-soothe. So we take deep breaths and we count to 3, or we count to 10, or we walk away, or we learn to express them in some other kind of way. We draw our feelings, or we talk about our feelings. Ideally, we talk about our feelings, and we put words to emotions. And then we have more control over them. And then children have to learn to recognize others' emotions. Little kids, even like 3, 4 years old, really will be very egocentric. And they will, if I feel a certain way, you feel a certain way. And it takes time to develop empathy and to recognize, oh my gosh, I think my friend is sad. They can do that in elementary or in preschool as well. They begin to do it in preschool. Like, why are you sad? You look sad. Like, we start to notice things like facial expressions and body displays of affects. All right, so here we go. What do we have when we're an infant? We begin life with contentment and distress. Remember I said homeostasis, imbalance, okay? We gradually add new feelings, fear and anger. By early childhood, children experience self-conscious emotions like shame, okay? Think about Erikson. We just talked about it. We've talked about shame and doubt, right, coming into play. Shame, and the reason we start to feel shame, quite frankly, is because our parents give us feedback that what we did was bad. And we begin to fear not just the loss of the parent, but the loss of their love. And that's kind of an Anna Freud concept there, and expands on what they're talking about here. Infants will respond to other people's emotions, right? I laugh, you laugh. Happy, happy, sad, sad. And they learn all of those things by mimicking the other people's facial expressions, mannerisms, and tones of voice, which you can find in babbling and stuff like that. Maybe we'll do something like that for your discussion. We'll see. So children increasingly reflect on and learn to regulate their emotions. They know, I'm mad, I'm angry with you. We want to teach them to say those things. Because if they don't have the words for it, they're going to act it out through their body. That's a psychoanalytic concept, right? So children who are acting out physically are often asking a question or expressing an emotion they do not have the words for. And so what we do is we go in, I didn't want to do that. We go in and teach them how to do that. And that's what your intervention specialists are doing. That's what everybody's doing when they're trying to manage a child's behavior. They develop a concern for others' feelings and develop personal styles of responding to stress. And so when they start to have friendships, they start to be invested in what other people are doing. Although tattlers, right? What is up with the tattler, the tattletale in your classroom? The tattletale in your classroom is a kid who is feeling like another kid's emotions are catchy, right? So I'm barely holding it together and that kid is misbehaving. And if he doesn't stop misbehaving, I'm going to start misbehaving and I'm going to lose control of myself. So I need to go tell the teacher to stop that kid from doing what he's doing, because I don't want to, I'm trying so hard not to join him, right? So when you have a tattletale, you can say, you know, what's important is you can be the boss of yourself even when Joey is acting up, right? Joey's having a trouble, but it doesn't have to be your trouble. You can manage, you're a big kid. You kind of reassure them that they don't have to take on the behaviors of other kids who might be having a trouble in the classroom. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. It's hard sometimes to do this without getting feedback on whether or not you're really understanding what I'm saying. But from the answers to the questions that you guys are doing every week, I feel like you guys are really grasping it quite nicely, actually. All right, the upper elementary and secondary years unleash new pressures and coping skills and coping skills have to expand to meet them. It shouldn't say they just do. You know, that's the adolescent thing where I said they have to do it all over again. Okay, here's just some stuff. I'm going to go this pretty quickly. So gender. There are no differences until about the age of 2, and then boys are more likely to show anger, girls are more likely to show sadness. Look, boys are external, girls are internal, right? The way to remember that, boys are genitally external, girls are internal genitally, and there is a correlation. I'm not going to say there's a causation, I'm going to say there's a correlation. In Freud's view, boys and girls develop differently because of those sorts of things, and we can argue about it or we can debate it, but boys tend to engage in external things, girls tend to engage in internalizing behaviors. So girls are more likely to do things like cut or starve themselves. Boys are more likely to get into fights and punch and kick, okay? Girls more likely to dwell on problems. Yeah. And then culture. Language emphasizes particular components of emotion. Different languages will have different words for different measures of emotion, like how many words does a language have for happiness or something along those lines. They guide rules and practices for how you talk and share your emotions. Different cultures are much more conservative. Others are much more expressive. And And then families differ within a culture. Then you have your family norms about how you handle emotions. Oh my gosh, there are so many little sitcoms based on how families handle emotions. Look at any sitcom and you can see that they create a family dynamic around how that family manages emotions and how they relate to each other around emotions. Socioeconomic status. Children from low SES families are more prone to anxiety, depression, and behavior problems. There's just more stress. Let's face it, there's more stress in their life. On a lower socioeconomic status, there's more stress in their life. Their parents are under more stress. And so that has an impact. You know, kids who don't have decent nutrition are more likely to be anxious. I mean, there's all kinds of things we know with regard to low socioeconomic status. Middle and high income children are sometimes exposed to unrealistic expectations. You know, these are the parents, they're talking about the parents that are like sending their kids to academic camps when they're 2 years old or whatever. Just putting that kind of pressure on them to succeed can create a ton of anxiety for different reasons. So promoting emotional development. So what are we going to do? We're going to help infants find comfort. Yeah, okay. We need to not help them find it. We need to give it to them. Pay attention to children's facial expressions. Underline this next part. Help them label their feelings and coach them and expressing them, which means giving them the words. Like, you really look frustrated right now. What can we do to work through this? Those kinds of things. Create warm, accepting environments where kids feel free to have their emotions, kind of a thing. Research-based curriculum to foster development really means there are so many programs out there right now to help kids social emotional. We saw that at Hathaway Brown. We saw it at Laurel. I think we even saw it at Hilltop when we did those observations. That focus on the social emotional development in early childhood is so important, because we know it's important for later capacities to be good learners. Age-appropriate outlets for emotional expression. Stopping your classroom and doing some conflict resolution if there are warring factions in your classroom is an educational experience. And then discussing emotions of characters in literature and history so that they can see examples. Using social stories. Right? Social stories are a big part of play. You can even have your class make up their own social stories to help them get through difficult times. The fact that they're being homeschooled right now. Ask children to guess the emotions that others are feeling. Not just guess, but how do you think Joey felt when you took his truck? Right? That's a start. Or how do you think Susie's felt when you called her a bad name? Right? So you can work those things in and help them to develop empathy. Take cultural and gender differences into account, and help children keep stress at a manageable level by managing the environment. Create a safe environment for them so that they are exposed to emotional stress in bearable bits and not in big fits and waves. Sometimes, like right now, we can't control that very much, but we try our best to control it by just letting them know that we have the big worries handled and they just need to worry about being a student right now. Does that make sense? Pay attention to your own emotions, because kids will learn to read them very quickly. If you don't like a kid, they're going to know it. You have to model appropriate ways of dealing with negative emotions, because you're going to feel them. You're going to get frustrated with them. If you're a screamer, your kids are not going to function in your classroom well. It's never going to work for you. Hollering at your kids is not okay. It just is not okay. You need to find a way. I don't care if you're turning off the lights or you're having people put their heads down, but hollering around the classroom and scaring kids is not going to, it might get you compliance, but it won't get you a good classroom. And obviously, okay, so let's talk about temperament. Temperament is this idea that we are born biologically predisposed to certain personality traits, right? So it's typical, stable ways of responding to events and novel stimulation and of regulating impulses. So children can be high or low. So extroversion, impulsivity and sensation seeking. So this is where you get your introvert versus extrovert stuff, which is sort of the popular culture stuff. I'm not going to go into that too much because popular culture pretty much has it down. The thing that you need to understand is that it's not that introverts don't like to be around people, they just find it emotionally draining. And so introverts need to get away from people to recharge, whereas extroverts, they get recharged by being around people and having that kind of input. And So negative affectivity, shy, frustrated, hard to soothe. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one way to describe that particular. So are you easygoing versus emotionally sensitive? So shy, frustrated versus go with the flow, hard to soothe versus being able to sleep through, Armageddon and the vacuum cleaner and all those sorts of things. And effort and control, and has how well you can strategically focus your attention. Are you distractible or are you not distractible? So temperament for sure has a genetic basis. It is very stable over time. And environments can instigate modifications in children's temperament. But I did an interview for an article on this. But you cannot make an introverted child an extrovert just because as the parent you are extroverted and you push your kid to be a performer. You cannot push your kid to become, you're just going to screw them up if you try to push kids to not be what they are. So you want introverted kids to find a middle ground, and you want extroverted kids to find a middle ground and be flexible in their approach, but you really can't force a kid to be more like you if you want them to be. Okay, so what is the difference between temperament and personality? Temperament is really how you handle your emotional regulation. Personality is a characteristic way a person thinks and behaves and feels. So temperament is seen as sort of what you're born with, and then it slowly develops through interaction with the environment into a personality. I think that's probably the best way to say that. And yeah, it can change slightly due to environmental demands. What they mean is that, like, in different contexts, you're going to show different aspects of your personality. So you want a flexible personality. Not all people. Some people are exactly the same in every situation. Other people can be more flexible in how they approach things based on context. So these dimensions of personality are done through factor analysis, and extroversion, we talked about that, socially outgoing, agreeableness. You can kind of see where the temperaments fit in here, right? The temperament for agreeableness is really that negative reactivity. So agreeableness is the extent of being warm and sympathetic versus being argumentative and contrary. Conscientiousness, extent of being persistent and organized. So that goes along with that focused one, right? So you can be highly conscientious or you can be sort of loose with that stuff, less organized. Neuroticism is the extent to which you are anxious and fearful versus nothing really ruffles you. And then openness to experience is about the extent of being curious and imaginative and adventurous versus playing it safe. Okay, I like this title, Helping Children Be Themselves. Identify the types of temperaments that you naturally prefer. Sometimes it's good to do exercises in the class about discovering this about your kids. How can you find them? What kinds of activities do they prefer? Do they seem to be loners or do they reach out to other kids? Are they anxious when you start a new topic and they worry they're not going to be good at it? Or are they ready to dive in and are they curious and adventurous? And so you consider their temperament when forming groups, you consider their temperament when you interact with them, and as the adult, you have to be the one that is flexible in how you work with and communicate with children based on understanding their temperament. So again, do you see, can you imagine for yourself, you've got 4 years to make all this work together, but this idea of, I'm not teaching you how to teach, I'm teaching you how to be a teacher, how to be with kids, how to be in a place of understanding them, seeing the world through their eyes. Is Susie an introverted, shy kid who tends to approach new things with anxiety and worry that they're not going to be good enough? They might be overly conscientious or perfectionist. That's Susie's personality. And so you as the teacher need to make sure she gets a lot of praise, and you need to, so there are all these things you need to understand about the differences in the personalities of the kids. And the more you understand these theories and the more you review them, the better teacher you're going to be, because it's not just the types of curriculum that you present to them, it is how you present that curriculum that makes a real difference in whether or not you're going to be a great teacher or a phenomenal teacher. Okay, and that's what we're going for, is phenomenal teacher. So recognizing the complexity of a children's personality. So here we go. Look at this. Extroverted children like opportunities to work with peers. And they may need reminders to stay focused. Children who are less agreeable may need encouragement to engage in prosocial behaviors. Those are the kids who are going to need maybe some social skills lessons. Children who are less conscientious can be taught to set goals and monitor their progress. They need some intentional work from you, and they won't come up with their own ideas about how to get organized or to set their goals. And kids who are a little more neurotic, those are the ones who need help with negative feelings and conflict resolution and not feeling really horrible about themselves when they make a mistake. Yeah, so this idea of children who are high in openness sometimes need help with motivation in school. You know why? It's because kids who are highly creative and open to new experiences get bored easily with the routine and the structure and the standardization of school. That's what's really going on there. All right, we're not going to obviously be able to cover all of these in depth as much as I would like to, but I scratch that out. I do not talk about bipolar disorder when I talk about common emotional and behavior disorders in children. I will never, ever, ever talk about bipolar disorder in a child. I will talk about explosive disorder. I will talk about mood regulation issues. I will talk about autism. I will talk about a lot of things, but I will not talk about bipolar disorder in children. They're too young, and it drives me crazy that it's even in your book. Scratch it out. Depression, okay? More common at or after adolescence. Bipolar disorder cannot be diagnosed in young children, okay? It's just not. Anxiety disorders may be related to insecure attachments. It could be separation anxiety. It can be a mistrust in the fact that today and tomorrow are going to be the same, all kinds of things like that. And then conduct disorder, remember I said girls are internal, boys are external. So conduct disorders are more common in boys. And I also don't believe in conduct disorders, to be honest with you. I think that every behavior has a meaning and is asking a question. And I think calling somebody a conduct disorder kid just basically is a different way of saying they're a bad kid. I will never use that diagnosis, because for me, if a kid is acting out and engaging in a conduct disorder type way, my question is why? And it's usually due to a male's way of expressing anxiety, fear, worry, or depression. Okay? So I'm not a fan. Yeah. Okay, so how do you as a teacher support children and adolescents who face emotional challenges? Show interest in them and concern for their well-being. Teach social skills. Make social skills a part of your classroom etiquette. Provide structure to reduce anxiety. Be predictable. Be consistent. Set reasonable limits. Setting reasonable limits creates a consistent, predictable environment, which makes the environment safe for kids. They like rules and they like limits even when they push them. And be alert for signs of potential suicide. I mean, come on. Look, they say that, but don't take on that responsibility. If you see a child who's struggling and who's quiet and shut down and emotionally withdrawn, yeah, get that child help. But I don't like it when people say that, I don't know, somehow we could have seen things. We can't always predict those things. So just look for the kid who's really, really withdrawn. All right. So to wrap this up, you can read this. Yeah, I wish we had more time on this, but I'll do a few extra lectures around Freud and some of those developmental issues as well. But for now, we will stop